Welcome back to Upstream. I'm here with Tim Padgett going further upstream on my conversation with Dr. Glenn Sunshine, in which we ask the provocative question here on the eve of Thanksgiving: were the Pilgrims nuts? And this is a question that has kind of interested me since I had a conversation with an Anglican friend, an Anglican priest friend, very conservative, very much of one mind with me and my conservative Protestant friends on a lot of questions. But he does look at the whole project that the separatist that we know as the Pilgrims undertook as a little bit out there, a little bit crazy. And I think that kind of an increasing number of people are coming to see it that way. But this is also a cherished part of our national story, our national mythology. I don't use that in the sense of it's made up. I use it in the sense of this is a meaning-making story. So, Tim, thanks for joining me today. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the overall direction of the conversation, just what your impression of the Pilgrims is, because that's a discussion a lot of people are having this time of year.
It was really a pleasure just to hear Glenn talk his craft. I mean, you and I get to have these wonderful conversations with him every once in a while, but to hear him speaking of his particular craft and just his great knowledge was really encouraging. I think that you're saying the mythology is really hits the nail on the head, because it is part of the American mythology. It shapes us. It's an American ritual. I mean, you think about what it is, what Thanksgiving is. It is a sacred meal. It's the most traveled time of the year. Everyone goes back to their homes. You could even, if you want to do it like, it almost sounds like pagan. There's a sacrificial animal that we all consume, and there's special items on there. We all do the same things, and we reenact this thing again and again and again. And, we can say that in a way that makes it sound strange. But on the other hand, it also is a connection point to lots of other cultures who have lots of these other traditions. And I think we as Americans, we tend to think of ourselves as being traditionless, rootless. And there's something to that. But here's an example. We all have the cranberry sauce, and we all have the stuffing. It varies regionally, but there is something to the social media thing that I see every once in a while around this time. It says, nobody needs to take pictures of your meal today because we're all eating the same thing. We're all having the exact same meal. But yes, it is part of it. And I think not only is it this ritual meal aspect, which is very real, but the understanding of who these pilgrims were, what they came to do, even if we reject that myth, it is part of our myth. Again, the stereotype now, as you pointed out a couple of times, is it's not as popular a holiday. What do people want to do? They want to say, oh, the Pilgrims were evil, they were oppressive, they started this whole thing which led to all sorts of awfulness. Well, that's still part of the myth. Now, it's an inverted myth. It's an anti-myth. It's like the seeing Hitler as our moral center, because we want to do whatever we do is good, we see as what he wouldn't do. It's in the same sense that people look at the Puritans, they're coming over here, they're taking lands, they're establishing stuff, but it is part of our myth. And as I think you've seen in my notes, that I think there is a lot to say what these guys were up to that greatly shapes not just the people who like them, but even the people who don't like them, arguably even more than the people who like them.
Yeah, if I'm going to do any myth busting on this story, the story of the first Thanksgiving and then the people and the communities, I should say, in and around Massachusetts Bay that gave birth to that, I'm not going to attack the sort of good intentions or even in many cases the good behavior of the people, the moral upstanding behavior of the people who undertook that project. So, for instance, my understanding is that as far as English colonies in the New World, the Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay colonies actually did a phenomenally good job with relations toward the natives, for instance. So they had something like, most of a century, 80 years at least, of peaceful relations with the natives, which is much more than you can say for the colonies in the South, certainly places like Jamestown. And that's interesting. I think the myth I would want to bust is the folk perception in Thanksgiving that we have some sort of direct historical or even political continuity with these people. And I think it is helpful to recognize, especially as we have conversations about, what we brought up Christian nationalism, which is a thing that's kind of being discussed right now in certain teapot-sized circles within online Christendom. But that is one answer to the question of whether we should openly recognize and legislate values, religious values in government. I think it's a very interesting and important conversation because I'm not convinced that a religiously or value neutral government is possible. So the Pilgrims offer us one answer, one very self-consciously religious answer to the question of what kind of values and religion will government actually espouse. Our Constitution and then the subsequent development of American legal theory and tradition offers a somewhat different answer. And I think that we have to be honest about the discontinuity there, the fact that the sort of charter statements and sermons that the leaders of the Pilgrims left us are very different from, Thomas Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist Association or whatever. These are very different philosophies of the role of religion in government. And I greatly admire the Pilgrims Project. It's just unclear to me as a reader and a podcaster and just someone who's curious about history, how much of that really carried forward, how much of that we can really appropriate as Americans under the U.S. Constitution and say, yes, that's our story. I'm not really sure. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think with a lot of questions like this, it depends on what you mean. I think if we're talking about direct lineage situations, well, no, what we have as the U.S. Constitution is not a one-to-one connection to the Mayflower Compact or other things like that. If you're talking about influence, well, that's another question. I may have mentioned this in one of our previous conversations here, but one time I was going through Francis Schaeffer's papers as part of my academic research, and there are these letters between him and a couple of prominent Christian historians, Mark Knoll and George Marsden. And I would love to go back and go through them again because that wasn't what I was there for, so I didn't get to spend much time on them. But one thing I noticed is that they were talking past one another in many ways. Francis Schaeffer, as you would know, and many of the audience might know, put a great deal of emphasis on the effect of Christian ideas, Reformation Christian ideas, on the development of liberty and things like that. The effect that had in such a way. Mark Knoll and George Marsden pushed back against that kind of thing because they said you can't find Jefferson citing the reformers. You can't find Washington doing that. And you have famous statements by many of the founders where they're not particularly Christian at all. But if you look at it like, those are two different conversations that are going on. Schaeffer's talking about influence. Schaeffer's talking, you might say, is preempting the Tom Holland, Glenn Scrivener conversation of that the ideas that later became the liberties of the free world are grounded in assumptions about Christianity, assumptions derived from Christianity. So if you're looking for X leads to Y leads to Z, and we go from the Mayflower Compact to the Declaration of Independence to the U.S. Constitution, well, it's a little harder. But if you want to talk about if part of the same conversation, part of the same flow of things, there is something to it. Because in one sense, the entire separatists, the Pilgrims, remember, they're not just Puritans, but they're separatists, they're saying there should be another way. The state is wrong here, and we need to do something else. We need to create a parallel structure. Now, they did not do this perfectly. They, again, said they were a lot more doctrinaire, even than you and I as fellow Reformed people. We'd find them pretty fussy about a lot of things. But they were saying there should be a difference between what the state decrees and what God calls you to do. You might say that's a first step. It's not religious liberty in the full sense of the word, but it is this, at the time, fairly radical idea, even implicit idea, because I don't think they would have quite understood what they were getting at. It's this implicit idea that the state could be wrong, and there should be a difference between what the state decrees and what we know to be true about God. And that's what Glenn got at in some of, if he pointed at about the early church, Lactantius and people like that. These are Christians who are arguing for not a full religious liberty, definitely not a religious relativism, but this idea that the state shouldn't be involved in those affairs. There needs to be, you render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and under God what is God's. There's a difference there. It's not that it's not important, but there's a difference. So I think that depends on what you mean. Do you mean that we should be a Christian nation now because the Mayflower Compact was clearly, explicitly acknowledging, Jesus Christ and all this kind of stuff? Well, no, it doesn't mean that. But do we get our liberties from the same source that they were talking about? Absolutely. And it's the sine qua non. Again, this is the Tom Holland argument. You don't get contemporary liberties without a Christian understanding of humanity.
One of the fascinating points you made in your notes to me earlier, Tim, was that, of course, the Pilgrims are one small splinter group of the much larger Puritan movement in England, and they leave because they just think it's too far gone. We have to establish our own thing. But we have to remember they're co-religionists who didn't go to New England, who stayed in Old England, right? And for a while there, they came into a great deal of political power. And you mentioned Oliver Cromwell and the sort of groundwork that was laid there for even a religious toleration. So there's a very important genealogical link between the Pilgrims and their project and their co-religionists in England, who are laying foundations that will eventually become, the kind of religious toleration that took hold and that we know even today in England and to some extent America. That was interesting. So for those who aren't familiar with the story of what unfolded there when the Presbyterians took over Parliament, so to speak, give us the rundown and why that's important to the story of religious liberty more broadly.
Sure. Well, you do have in early 17th century England and across the Channel in France, you have this growing idea of the divine right of kings. The idea that the king is in power by the hand of God and he can do pretty much whatever he wants. Now, we today tend to think of that as the standard royal understanding of things. Well, not exactly. In previous times, the kings had limited power. You see that in English history with things like the Magna Carta. It's not full democracy, but it is saying the king can't do whatever he wants. He's responsible to certain rights that the people have.
The law is above the king. He's not identical to the law.
Exactly. Yes, the law is above the king. He is the agent of the law, not the other way around. And you do have it in England, this the Stuart dynasty, James I, as in the King James Bible. He was very much caught up into this, that he was placed on the throne by God. He had a right to do it. And that's the era that the Pilgrims are coming out of, that they're leaving during that time. His son comes to the throne, King Charles, not the present King Charles, but this is King Charles I. He comes to the throne, and he has many of those same ideas, except like many sons of powerful men, he's a little bit of a weaker man. And he gets himself into trouble and gets into a spat with Parliament to the point that they get into a civil war. The Parliament at the time was dominated by Puritans. So theologically very similar to the Pilgrims, but the difference is they stuck around. Not only did they stay in England, but they stayed largely within the Church of England. This civil war goes on for several years. It's actually a fairly complex story, but eventually Parliament wins. So it's as though there were a war between the president and the Congress in the United States. It doesn't work that way here, but still, that's the closest analogy. One of the main military leaders was this guy, Oliver Cromwell. Now, we don't usually associate Puritan military dictator and religious liberty, and you shouldn't go overboard with this at all, because particularly if you ask anyone from Ireland, he made a few brutal mistakes, to put it mildly. He was not always a nice guy, but he was also convinced about the limitations of the state. He was convinced partly because of his Calvinistic understanding of human nature, or we could talk for our Jansenist friends, their Augustinian understanding of human nature, that you can't trust people, even can't trust the state. There's nobody who can be fully trustworthy. And so you have in this first Commonwealth, Cromwell makes several statements about that it's not the state's job to enforce these things. Now, it was clearly a state church. This was a state church, but he also didn't see it as being the state's right to determine those matters. So don't think a secular republic. It was not. But it was one of the first times where someone is saying that the government shouldn't be making doctrinal decisions, which is a bit of a departure from what had been traditional, forever. Now, eventually, Cromwell dies. His son's briefly in power. Then King Charles, the previous king, comes back to power. The son comes in, but he has some limitations. He has some of those ideas, but the government, the army, is basically saying you don't push too far. Eventually, his brother comes to the throne, James II, but he is overthrown by his own daughter, which had to be embarrassing at family meals thereafter. But they come in. It's the Glorious Revolution, and there's this whole list. It's a Bill of Rights. And it's establishing that the right, all sorts of rights that we think of as American rights from the 1770s and 1780s, the English were already established in there in the 1688, 1689, and things like that. The Glorious Revolution or the Bloodless Revolution. So it is interesting that these same people, these same conversations that the Pilgrims are starting to have, as you say, the co-religionists are putting it together imperfectly, deeply flawed, but they're having those first steps to what we now think of as classic English-speaking world liberties.
I had a friend who quipped one time that peaceful protests only work if your government speaks English. And that that observation kind of rings true historically. It comes out of this very, complex but distinctive process that happened in England, especially. So where everything from, 1215 onwards through the English Civil War, centuries later into the developments after that, you have this conversation about exactly what role the king has, and then what role he has, with respect to the government, and then with respect to the people, and especially in terms of the religious question. So the Puritans are adjudicating what exactly can the government tell ministers they have to do. Can they tell them they have to have a certain polity, they have to wear certain vestments, they have to say certain prayers, use a certain book, have a certain liturgy? And those are all questions that are very hotly debated in there. And it's interesting when you get into reading about it, you find out that in many cases, it's not the thing itself that they're so ticked about. It's the fact that the king wants to tell them what they should do in worship. That's what they care so much about. And that's what they think is a violation of their conscience, and then their reading of scripture, which they say is captive only, as Luther would say, to the word of God. And this whole process is developing and unfolding out of that Reformation principle, which was that scripture is the highest authority. And that's the final court of appeals to which we're ultimately answerable. And this, to me, it looks like to me, my lay, untrained perspective as a reader of history, it looks to me like this is an essential seedbed of what we come to view as religious liberty ultimately, because you have these very ancient precedents, and Lactantius and Tertullian and people like them, who says you can't force the conscience, right? You can't force true faith or belief. But the fact is that the medieval church tried its darndest to force belief in many circumstances. Forced conversion was a reality. And you have the Protestants eventually coming to this conclusion, which was in the Catholic tradition, but had been obscured in many cases, that no. The job of the government is to govern external behavior. And we would say, and many, like even Anglicans would argue, external behavior includes things like the liturgy, the polity of the church, the vestments, all that. But we have to back off from this idea that you can convert people or force faith or things like that, because that's not actually true. You can't do that. And that's the beginning of something very much more interesting, that toleration that comes around. And then eventually what we call religious freedom, which is very difficult to define, it turns out, because the American version of religious freedom, I think guys like Joe Rigney have argued this pretty successfully, was not a religious indifferentism. Even Thomas Jefferson's ideal never really triumphed entirely. His idea of a separation of church and state, for instance, which comes from that letter to a Baptist association that I mentioned earlier, right? It's not in a founding document, but it is his explanation of what they did. Even that is never really fully realized. Instead, you get something like what Rigney calls a religious establishment on a dimmer switch, where there's like it's like the U.S. Constitution is set in place, but all the authors of the Constitution and the signers are saying this only works if the people are extremely religious. And what they mean by extremely religious is not Islamic. What they mean is roughly Protestant with a little bit of this and that mixed in along the sides. And that raises an interesting question for us, because that is no longer the distinctive character of the polity that's under that Constitution. So does it still work? To me, that's an open question. And if I had, one of the Puritan fathers here and one of the Pilgrims here, and he said, "How's your project working out? How's your American constitutional disestablishment project working out, Shane?" And I'd say, "Well, it doesn't look so good. Maybe we should talk about what you guys did and learn some stuff."
Yeah, I mean, I think that we are seeing, I think, some of the effects of a loss of some kind of religious consciousness in American society, because we have these rights, we have these privileges, we have all these things like that, but we don't have a governing myth any longer, really, other than I do what I want to do. As you and Glenn pointed out, what we do have a governing religion in America. It's just, absolute autonomy, self-expressionism, critical theory, all those things kind of thrown together. also with, or as Francis Schaeffer put it, a personal peace and affluence. I want to be left alone, and I want to make money, and that's basically all that there is. Some combination of that, but not really taking any sort of serious religious idea seriously. And I think that what we're seeing in the increased rancor in society is very much the result of the fact that we need, as human beings, to believe in something ultimate. We need to believe there really is justice, there really is morality, there really is right, there really is wrong. But our formal stated beliefs about God as a culture, I don't mean you and I, but as a culture, are very atomized. You do you, I do me, everybody's fine. It's very unfulfilling. That understanding of human nature, that personal peace and affluence, is insufficient. And so people are launching into political causes in order to not to create a great society, but to create in themselves a sense of justice, that I am doing right, which all fits. It ends up with a very chaotic world. It ends up with a world where each of us is putting forward a truth claim that none of us believes is actually true. And so you end up with lots of conflicts like that. So, I mean, what does it mean? I mean, is the American experiment doomed because of this? I think that nature abhors a vacuum, and human nature abhors a vacuum. And I think that's the power of these critical theories and conspiracy theories. As I put in the notes, if you look at the layout of critical theories and conspiracy theories, they both posit pretty much the same thing. And that is that there's more going on in the world. There are malevolent forces, and they are causing the problems that are in society. We need to get rid of them. And the way that you get rid of them is by becoming, stop being sheeple, stop being, you need to become woke, all this kind of stuff. The solution is very much the same. So that is, in one sense, the American religion right now. It's this critical conspiracy theory hybrid nonsense. And it's very destructive because it is missing something that the Puritans got, and the Pilgrims were only hinting at, and that is people are messed up. As Glenn said, the lack of an understanding of original sin is what gets you things like divine right of kings. What gets you, in England, they managed to throw them out, the divine right of kings things, but in France, they didn't. And what do you end up with? You end up with an absolute tyranny, which then leads to a revolution in 1789, which itself is its own absolute tyranny in the end. And so we do need something that recognizes that there is a law higher than the king, a law higher than the state, a law higher than society. So you do need a religious understanding that isn't absolutizing. It's absolutizing in the sense that it's all-encompassing, but it's not this unification of ideology and the state. You need to have a limited state, because otherwise you're going to end up with a tyranny one way or the other.
In many ways, Os Guinness's project in the last few years, several of his books, but it's really come to a head in some of his more recent books, is arguing exactly that there is a kind of religious underpinning. He thinks of it as a Judeo-Christian underpinning to the American project in particular. So, he thinks that, I think it's Last Call for Liberty, where he really asks that question: are we going to become a nation of 1776 or 1789? Are we going to be people of the American Revolution or the French Revolution? The basis of that question is really that the two are different, that the French Revolution has at its foundation a repudiation of all that came before, the ancien regime, the old way of doing things, which encompasses not just the kings, but the priests, the religion, the religious underpinning of the morality and society and government of Catholic France. And they threw all that out. And let's just say, they had a lot of bloodshed, and then in short order, they got a new dictator. And the rest is history. That's one answer to the question. The other answer is the American one, which he sees as very distinct. It was touched by the Enlightenment. In many ways, there are Enlightenment liberal principles at work in America. And, we would contrast that with more traditionally conservative or religious principles. But I think Os Guinness has done a good job of arguing that, and many others, he's drawing on a ton of other people's work. He's writing popular books that summarize this for the general audience. But he is making the case that though the U.S. Constitution says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, it nevertheless assumes on some very deep level that the people it's governing are a religious people, are a moral people, do have Judeo-Christian values at the foundation of their thinking, and are covenanting together to get along in a federalist arrangement on the basis of those values. And if you were to substitute fundamentally different values from some other religion or post-religious values like the secular project, or perhaps Marxist values under the American Constitution, does it work? And I think his argument is, pretty forcefully that it does not work. You cannot have that. So the choice before us is not a choice of swapping out the Constitution for something more explicitly religious or something like that, but it's the choice of whether we're going to be the kind of people who can be governed by this document. And the interesting part, Tim, is when you read the American founders, I think there's a couple of mistakes you can make. The first mistake is the typical secular one, where you're just like, they were all just a bunch of unbelieving apostates and they had no real religious convictions, and that's just a pious myth that Americans like to believe. And then the other one is to dive wholeheartedly into the pious myth and say, they were all evangelical Christians. No, they weren't. There were quite a few who were very much what we'd call deist, or very light theists. I would argue that someone like Benjamin Franklin fits the definition of deist pretty poorly, because he seems to be an interventionist. He also is not an Orthodox Christian by any stretch of the imagination. So it's like, what do you do with him? These guys, even the deists among them, are very, very clear again and again about this sort of essential requirement of the American Republic they've set up. And that is that it only works if you've got a moral and religious people. It only works if the people continue being a people of conviction, a people of faith, a people who have a higher standard and a higher Lord than just Caesar. It's like you can multiply the number of times that this sort of thing appears. Like Washington's farewell address is a good example. We were talking about Washington before we came on here. We can debate what precisely his religious convictions were, but he spares no ink or no time in sort of making it clear that, look, people, you got to continue to be devotedly religious people, and otherwise your project doesn't work. That's very, very interesting to me. I don't know why. He called them indispensable supports, I think, of the American project. Why is that the case if it's true that the American project is a departure from, say, the things that the folks on board the Mayflower believed? It's not in a wholehearted sense. There's something of an amalgamation going on here. And that's what makes it so interesting and, so historically distinctive.
Yeah. I mean, do you have to have religious faith to have a constructive democratic government? Whether democratic government like a federal republic like we have in the United States, or a constitutional monarchy like you have in the United Kingdom or various other places? No, not exactly. But you almost have to assume it. You mentioned Washington. And who else is up there on Mount Rushmore? You got Lincoln. You got Jefferson.
And then Roosevelt hanging out there.
Yeah, with his face off to the side there, yeah. Yeah, and so they're all there. And then you think of some of the great heroes of democracy in the English-speaking world. You've got Margaret Thatcher, and I don't know much about her personal faith, but you think about Winston Churchill, who I believe his phrase was, I could hardly be called a pillar of the church, perhaps more of a flying buttress. He supports it from the outside. Yeah, was Winston Churchill a Christian? No, I don't think so. Did he believe in Christianity? I wouldn't say he believed in Christ, but I think he believed in Christianity. He's deeply drawing on a Christian understanding of what it meant to be human, and that human beings mattered. That you have to have a government. He has both ends of what Christians offer to kind of to political understanding of things is the Imago Dei, that humans are special. One of my favorite moments when my son was about 4 years old, I was explaining to him history and talking about slavery, and he kind of looked up at me and goes, "Dad, people are special. You shouldn't sell them." I'm like, that is the perfect example of why slavery is wrong, because people are special. It's got that. But Churchill also has, what you don't have in communism or fascism or wokeism or lots of other utopian ideas, is original sin. Again, I don't think that Churchill believed in the doctrines of Augustine, but I'm pretty sure he read him and he knew of him. And he knew that human beings, it's that mixture. Liberty doesn't come from people simply being special. It comes from that understanding that people are special, but people are broken. You got to have both those things. And it's holding those two in tension is what Christianity brings to the story. And if you don't hold those two in tension, you're going to end up with tyranny or naivete, which leads to a tyranny. Utopianism leads to tyranny because, as Glenn talked about, if you are someone who believes that people are perfectible in this world using human means, you're going to create a tyranny because if there is an outside element, it's because they're not just disagreeing with you, but they are they're not just incorrect, they're morally wrong fully in every sense of the word. It lacks a category for a moral dissent. So I was watching some clips about the movie, the HBO thing about Chernobyl, and something I've heard of before, that like the meltdown, and that the people on site, they couldn't believe that the system was failing because it was a perfect system, because the best people had made it. And you end up with disasters. You see that all across.
Soviet systems containing radioactivity never fail. That just never happens.
Yeah, exactly. Except for that time, yeah. And so I think you see that anytime you have a utopian society, as you and Glenn pointed out, you either end up with some sort of weird sexual, domination thing, or they make silverware, or brooms, whatever, the shakers, as you pointed out, the people who died out. You end up with this. It's a non-flourishing society because they think it's a perfectible society. And the Pilgrims, they may have failed they may have been closer to the idea of perfectible society and helped to contribute to the idea common in America. If you look at like early 19th century, in late 18th century, all these utopian societies are born in the Northeast of the United States, and they're trying to create this perfect society. That is the gift the Puritans gave us, that the Puritans would reject, because they didn't believe that people were perfect. But in practice, they kind of acted almost like it was possible, or at least close to possible. When the Puritans failed in that, they failed to pass on to, as you guys were discussing, they failed to pass on to the subsequent generations the fallibility of humanity. They thought they could make it work here. And you can't make it's the whole thing of you can't escape from yourself. You can't escape from your sin. And that's part of the problem.
Yeah, this is why I'm inclined to be sympathetic in many ways with the Pilgrims and the whole New England colonial beginning. Because as you suggested in your notes, you can't put moral zealotry away. You can't say, we're not going to answer key questions about morality and justice and ultimate truth in our government. We're just going to have a values neutral government. You just can't do that. You can't do it for long, at least. Chesterton observed that distaste for dogma is really just a preference for unstated dogmas. And those stated dogmas very quickly come out and assert themselves in the form of ideology. So, you could picture some modern person meeting the crowd on board the Mayflower and saying something to the effect of, "You stupid, morally censorious Puritans, we've moved beyond your ways. And don't you dare question our sacred values of equal rights and self-expressive individualism, or we'll censor you," because that's what, a Nazi would do. That's Hitlerish. And the whole thing quickly revolves, or it becomes clear that it revolves around counter claims that are deeply moral and almost religious. They're metaphysical. They're based on this belief that there are almost self-evident truths. And of course, Tom Holland and Glenn Scrivener, who we constantly refer to, are so much fun in part because they take this secular presumption that there are certain self-evident truths about human equality and rights and so forth to task, and they just say, no, this is the least self-evident thing in the world historically. The only reason that you believe this at all is because there's this like leftover Christian influence that has shaped your sensibilities, but you're using it to argue for things that Christians would never argue for. So you're just standing out in space, or as Os Guinness says, it's like a cut flower civilization. Or I think Scrivener, I forget what his metaphor for it exactly was. It was kind of comical, but you get the sense of someone just suspended in. Yeah, he says it's a castle suspended in midair. That's what he said. The whole rights edifice is a giant castle suspended in midair. There's no foundation for it. And it all consists of moral counterclaims. It's built of that. So don't come at you may disagree with the project of the Pilgrims, or of Oliver Cromwell, or of the Catholic predecessors of the French Revolution, who, the monarchs who ruled France from a Roman Catholic standpoint. But let's, as Lewis would say, let's have none of this patronizing nonsense about there being a value neutral public square, and you not needing to actually assert certain truths about the world and human beings and morality in law. Because of course you have to assert them. There is no alternative. Otherwise, you just have moral anarchy, and no one is actually prepared to stomach that. Everyone thinks there should be government that asserts certain things, like, whether it's the equality of gay people and their right to marry, or the fact that witches ought to be burned. As Lewis says, you will assert something. And I think that's undeniably true. And that's also why the American Project is so interesting and appealing in some ways, because as Dr. Sunshine pointed out, Glenn, he gets angry when I call him Dr. Sunshine. I'll say Glenn. As Glenn points out, the American Project is federalist in nature, right? So I'm not sure to what extent the drafters of the Constitution were okay with states continuing to have some sort of established religion or official church, right? But it seems clear to me that they didn't tackle that issue in a head-on way. They didn't say, we're going to set up a fully secular republic at every level now. It seems like there was a lot of tolerance for flexibility, and you guys in Rhode Island, you can keep doing your religious tolerance. What would they be, Baptist? What was Roger Williams?
Yeah, Baptist.
Yeah, right. So you guys are going to be super tolerant up there. Maryland, you guys chilling out there with the Catholics, we can deal with that, so long as you don't try to subvert our government or bomb Congress like y'all did in England with Parliament. We're good with that too. Virginia, I guess Virginia was like predominantly Anglican at the time. And all these different areas are going to be able to work together. Their laws are informed by their separate or their distinctive religious character, right, of each colony. And of course, Massachusetts and Connecticut would have been dominated by these Puritan folks. And then by then there's a lot of Unitarian influence as well. But all those things were able to hold together under this Constitution, which is interesting and not really something that's been done historically. I tend to have a good bit of admiration for it, even if it's not a perfect system.
Yeah, it is interesting just looking over the historical times and that they managed to hold it together. They were the culmination, not the final culmination, but the culmination of decades and centuries, and even millennia of Christian thought within the church, as Tom Holland likes to point about the canon law issues beginning to arise in the 12th century and whatnot and later, but also the result of religious wars in the previous century. This is the 1700s when they established the U.S. Constitution. Well, the 17th century, the 1600s were racked by wars. And part of what the European settlement came to be was, maybe trying to force each other to kill each other in order to all agree on religion isn't a very effective idea. Whether or not it should be, they just realized this doesn't work well. And I think that having that pragmatic approach was really one of the genius things. They said, these religion matters, but it's not it's not the state's job to do that. And I think that's one of the key things that we have lost in contemporary debates, is because we've lost that distinction between the role of a state and the role of religion. Religion is to be a part of society, whether you call it a religion like you and I do when we go to church, or you call it a belief system or a critical theory or what have you. You're going to have these guiding principles, and they're not going to get along. And trying to use the state to batter each other's heads in order to agree on it is not going to work. And so I think that is one of the main things that we have lost, that we owe to people like the Puritans, that we would be good to recover.
Well, Tim, I enjoyed this conversation. I do want to ask you one last question before we sign off here. What's your Thanksgiving look like? Because I know we're recording this on the eve of Thanksgiving Day, and that's become a family thing as well as a recognition of national heritage and story. So what are you guys up to?
Well, usually we've been having Thanksgiving. Actually, even before we moved here to Colorado, we had Thanksgiving with one set or another of fellow Southerners. And you know what Southern food is like. And it tends to be heavy on heavy. And we are having Thanksgiving with some other friends from our church who are not Southerners. So it remains to be seen what that will be like. Hopefully, I assume that it's an American meal and everyone will have all their delightful stuff. So we're going to some friend's house tomorrow, a bit of an earlier one, about a lunchtime rather than a dinner time. And so we're going to, the boys and I will get up and we will watch the parade and watch the Snoopy Thanksgiving movie, and then head off to our friend's house and then come back and be comatose for the rest of the day.
That sounds great. Gravy is a universal love language, though. Like if you're Northerner or Southerner, it doesn't matter. You just pile on the gravy and you'll be good. And it goes on everything too. There's literally nothing. Okay, I guess you probably don't want it on pumpkin pie, but you know what I'm saying.
You could mix it all, I guess. Yeah.
Oh, yuck. My day tomorrow looks like the typical day of dividing it between two families and a little bit of driving in between. But I'm looking forward to it, especially the evening with my family, because we have this longstanding tradition that you can only do in a place like Florida, where we just we do it outside. We eat outside, so we set up all these tables and we have a fire, and it'll be like flannel shirt weather, but it won't be it won't be deadly to be outside at night. And I just love that. Having come back from Denver last week at ETS and just being shocked by how incredibly cold it is there, and the snow that got dumped on us and the terrible driving during that. I'm just grateful to be where I am and not in somewhere like Massachusetts either. So,
absolutely.
Looking forward to it. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. Thanks for listening, and Tim and I will be back to talk about the next episode of Upstream. See you then.